My name is Larry, and you're listening to the Tolkien Podcast. From the previous audio clip, many of you will have recognized the voice of Ian McKellen as Gandalf just before he descends into an abyss with the Balrog, and he tells the companions of the Fellowship of the Ring, "Fly, you fools." Readers of J.R.R. Tolkien will have long ago noted that none of his word choices were casual. They were specific and intentional. Just as this podcast has intentionally chosen that clip to start a discussion of one of the kind of hilariously cliched but yet always fervent discussions about whether Balrogs do or do not have wings. We're going to talk about that today, but not just that. We're going to talk about Balrogs in general because they're pretty cool visually and in book form, and they have an interesting history. In Tolkien's greater legendarium, in his larger works, Valar are the powerful beings that created heaven and earth. That's in very simplified terms. Maiar are beings of great power who are not quite Valar, and they include people like Gandalf and the Balrog we meet in the Fellowship of the Ring. They are ancient beings, so ancient that when Tolkien's world, his creation, well, not Tolkien's, the one Tolkien told us about, when the creation was sung into existence, these ancient beings, these what we would later call Balrogs, were among those who sang along with the discordant notes and verses in the creation of the world. They sort of opposed the main tune set by the main composer, if you will. So that's pretty old. So Sauron, the main bad guy that most everyone knows from the Lord of the Rings, his big bad daddy was Melkor, and these Balrogs were servants of Melkor. Now, these Maiar, whether they be Gandalf or whether they be Balrogs, aren't necessarily tied to physical form. I think a great illustration of how they're not tied to physical form was Sauron, who was a Maia as well. We know that he appeared in the Lord of the Rings as a great flaming eye, but he also appeared, at least in the Lord of the Rings movies, as a embodied in a suit of armor with a ring on his finger. And in the books as well, the ring was cut from his finger and lost. He had poured much of his power into that ring, but critically we can see that he had taken a physical form, and while that was great for him, it wasn't the final word of how he would appear. So Gandalf, another example of a Maia who was Gandalf the Grey and was undone by a fellow Maiar, and then was Gandalf the White, a sort of reborn or redone physical being. So these Balrog fellows were in powerful company and were themselves pretty powerful. The other names, the one that we encounter with Gandalf is Durin's Bane, meaning that he was the destruction or the ruin of Durin. One thing I'm finding complicated about this topic is that every time I mention something, I think I need to at least make a note of what that thing is. Durin is the eldest of the dwarf fathers, fashioned under the earth by Vala Aule. Also, if you're not following every word or syllable, it's okay. This is just a little background. It's not vitally important. You can Google it, or you can we can talk about it more. But Aule is one of the Vala who loved to make things, and one of his apprentices was Sauron, funny enough. So Sauron, of course, was good at making things, like rings, for example. So these ancient creations of the ultimate creator, these Balrogs, were drawn to the splendor of Melkor, we are told. And they chose to wreathe themselves or wrap themselves, their essence or their bodies, in shadow and flame. The flame could be described as their heart, as the core of these demons, and also their whips. And as you know, if you know that Tolkien loved names and loved to name things, their very name means demon of might or demon of power. So literally, Bal means power, and Raug or Rog means demon. So power demon, which sounds like a cool sports car, a muscle car maybe. There's an important note that Christopher Tolkien leaves in the Silmarillion that says, as he collected and disseminated his father's writings, that it wasn't useful or fruitful to try to make everything reconciled to everything else. So, in fact, he said it would be to the detriment of the work. So there are, as Tolkien wrote, as J.R.R. Tolkien wrote, there's different versions of what Balrogs were and what they are. And it's not always useful to, according to Christopher, it's not always useful to compare them and to try to make sense of them. Sometimes they are what they are, a living document in progress that the author didn't always have an absolute idea about. Don't hold my feet to the fire, but I believe in the Book of Lost Tales. Originally, Balrogs were maybe less terrible, but were greater in number. I seem to think maybe even in the hundreds. And then later they were reduced in number, but made more great and more terrible. They had armor in some versions, so that would connote that they were vulnerable, that they were physically vulnerable. I guess Sauron wore armor, but surely Gandalf never did. Anyway, their numbers were reduced, and then in a margin in a note, Tolkien wrote that there would be no more than 7 of them. He was aware of the significance of numbers. I'm not putting great meaning into that, but I like to think maybe there were 7 of these terrible Balrog creatures in all of Middle-earth. We have names for the one that we're all most familiar with. I think we'll talk about those names later, but there was another one called Gothmog, who was sort of the head Balrog. In early versions of the Legendarium, and we are getting into the weeds here, which was not my intention, but here we are in the weeds. There was a one named Lungorthin, and don't hold my feet to the fire if that's not pronounced right, but it's spelled Lung, like lung, Orthin, Orthin, not thin, Lungorthin. And he was mentioned as a Lord of the Balrogs. Christopher Tolkien in commentary said he doesn't believe it's the same as Morgoth. We're really in the weeds. But those Balrogs are named. And Lungorthin, I believe, that's how I would say it, was kind of abandoned later. But he's notable. Now, in modern culture and pop culture and movie culture and in cool things and collectibles, the Balrog, as seen in Peter Jackson's movie The Lord of the Rings, that's specifically the Fellowship of the Rings film, is really cool. As evil things often are in cinema. They're really cool. Shadow and flame and scary, and any of us seeing one of those in real life would probably die of heart failure just at the very sight of them. And they're meant to inspire terror. And, Peter Jackson's, and this isn't an insult, but he's ultimately a horror filmmaker at heart, and he loves monsters, as do other filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro. And as a movie fan, so do I. And probably you do too. All of which makes talking about Balrogs fun, and probably makes talking about whether Balrogs have wings or not fun. I'm going to read, as it seems we do here in this podcast, I'm going to read some text. The real challenge here is not to let these episodes grow really long. And all of this so far has just been a preamble, and we're already at like 9 minutes. So maybe failure. Maybe I've failed to keep this one really short, which was definitely the goal. We are going to read, I am going to read, you're going to listen or not listen, as you will, to a chapter from The Fellowship of the Ring, which all of you have seen on cinema. I bet lots of people have read, but I'm going to assume there's people who haven't either. I'm going to not read the whole passage, but we'll see what happens. The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on the staff in his left hand, but in his other hand, Glamdring gleamed, cold and white. His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like 2 vast wings. That's my emphasis. Like 2 vast wings. It raised a whip, and the thongs whined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils, but Gandalf stood firm. "You cannot pass," he said. The orcs stood still, and a dead silence fell. I'm going to close that quote. We're going to talk about that for a minute. A few things. There's orcs about. There's this creature, this Balrog with capital B, by Tolkien, which does matter, with his whip of fire, a flame from his nostrils. That's fun. And Gandalf says, "You cannot pass." I have saved in the can, as they say in the biz. In the can, I have an interview that I did with Ian McKellen for an hour, actually. He invited me to his place, and that's not me name drop. Well, it is me name dropping, but really, he did. And we sat and talked. And one of the things I really was interested in is his. I feel like there's some quotes in movie history that are astounding, that are immortal, that never die. I think of the Jaws line, "You're going to need a bigger boat." Funny and yet it brings an emotion to the audience. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. I actually am not sure I quoted that correctly, but paraphrased it at least. You probably know the film. If you don't, we need to get you to the movies. Another one, though, is like, "May the Force be with you." Alec Guinness, as Obi-Wan Kenobi, said that line that has become a resounding clarion call in culture for the last 50 years, and it carries emotion with it. "May the Force be with you." Other people said it too, but it was always a callback to his words in the 1977 Star Wars film. So the original Star Wars film. So talking to Ian McKellen, I felt like he had one of those moments when he said in Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring, "You shall not pass." And he kind of tried to avoid the topic, actually. But I was, you only get to talk to Ian for an hour once, maybe. And so I politely persisted. This is from memory. I haven't listened to that in a while, but I do plan to put that on this podcast eventually. We'll put the whole Ian McKellen interview on. A little bit of it's dated because it was what was happening around that time, but in New Zealand. But I think it would be interesting. Anyway, he said, "Well, we got it wrong, didn't we?" He knew that the Tolkien quote was, "You cannot pass," but they, for film, decided that "you shall not pass," and I think it works fantastically in the film. And of course, I think Ian McKellen's the best. And like Alec Guinness, Ian McKellen's done lots of stage, lots of great film work. Probably less now. He's done some really funny stuff with Ricky Gervais. He has a wide range of things. He played a Nazi in a film, but he's immortal as Gandalf. He will never be forgotten for that. He's Magneto. He's probably will never be forgotten for that. But I think Gandalf will be the thing that resonates in time and often, very often. I bet you if they created a clip of his works, I just about guarantee you that "You shall not pass" will be right in there. And it's taken its place in culture, pop culture, as a meme. It appears everywhere. It's universal. Everyone knows what it means. It's immortal. It's an immortal moment of film. And he knew and said, "Well, we got it wrong, didn't we?" He knew that it wasn't what Tolkien said. Anyway, I'm going to resume reading. "You cannot pass," he said. The orcs stood still, and a dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Aenor. You cannot pass." He said it twice, and he's going to say it again. We should credit Ian McKellen and the scriptwriters of the Fellowship of the Ring, because he does the first time say, "You cannot pass." But I still contend it's that moment, "You shall not pass," will be the thing that he's remembered for. And I think in terms of cinema, it's good to have a change verbally. So I'll pick up and continue reading, which won't last long before more commentary. "The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass," for the third time, end quote. He names the Balrog there. Udun is a Elvish word, which means the pit or hell. So he's calling him the flame of hell. An insult, but also a name. This is a little sidebar. I don't know who has read Sir Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea books, but she makes a whole series, which is highly recommended, by the way, fantasy lovers, she makes a whole series out of the magic that is based on the naming of things. And I have no idea how Tolkien may or may not have influenced her, but I suspect he did. And this idea of naming a thing as a power, I read all of this as Gandalf casting a spell. He's not just saying words to intimidate the Balrog. He's literally casting a spell, and we're watching him do it. He's commanding this thing, the spirit. You cannot pass, he's telling them. I think all of this is a spell, and he's using the Balrog's name to do it. I think maybe we'll keep reading. The Balrog made no answer. The flame in it seemed to die. That's the end quote again, but the darkness grew. Oh, sorry, not end quote, but the darkness grew. This to me reads that his spell is having some effect. It's here's the really important part in the debate of whether Balrogs have wings. I'm going to start again so that I don't interrupt the flow. The Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. But still Gandalf could be seen glimmering in the gloom. He seemed small and altogether alone, gray and bent like a wizened tree before the onset of a storm. That line there where it says the Balrog drew itself up to a great height and its wings were spread from wall to wall would be the very line that people that contend Balrogs have wings use the most to say it conclusively. Now, and remember, I think we mentioned earlier that Christopher Tolkien said it's not always useful or possible, or it maybe works to its detriment to compare or try to align, say, the Silmarillion or older works with the Lord of the Rings. Surely the Lord of the Rings is exactly what Tolkien meant it to say. So it's the definitive text, not maybe the text that Christopher gathered together at a later date. Those should never be ignored, of course. They're incredibly important, and they add depth and knowledge. But this is the definitive Tolkien quote. But here's the important thing to remember. I'll read it again. And suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. What's really important is to remember that there's some earlier text describing what these metaphorical wings are. I'm going to read again, quote, his enemy halted again facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like two vast wings. This is a creature of shadow and flame, and it very clearly, the flame is a simile. It's like two vast wings. So 2 paragraphs later, when it says its wings were spread from wall to wall, it seems apparent to me that this is the same simile that's being, I sure hope I'm using that correctly. It's the same simile, the word simile, I mean. It's apparent that this shadow spreads. He's this shadow that's like two wings spreads from wall to wall. And then Gandalf is there. I think Tolkien's really trying to draw that image of this great mass of shadow and Gandalf standing alone, small in the gloom, glimmering, alone, gray, and bent. I'm going to continue reading. I didn't think I would, but I think it's worth some text here. From out of the shadow, a red sword leaped, flaming. Glammed and glittered white in answer. So Tolkien's using color to contrast this flame, and then the pure white, the white light, which Tolkien uses often, including with the Silmarils. Think of the gift that Galadriel gives to Frodo. Her most precious star, she said. And then there's a clash, and the bridge sways, and Gandalf again says, "You cannot pass." And I think that's in the film where we hear, "You shall not pass." With the bound, the Balrog leaped full upon the bridge. Its whip whirled and hissed. Podcaster note, I am not a paid professional book reader. So, I'm jumping around and offering commentary and thoughts. Aragorn wants to help, invokes the name of Elendil, says he's with you, and Gondor says Boromir, who also leaps after, and then Gandalf, I read it as, realizes that these people, he's going to possibly lose Aragorn and Boromir as well in this fight, which is terribly brave, by the way. But the thongs of this whip lash around his knees, and it drags him to the brink. And I'm reading again, he staggered and fell, gasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. "Fly, you fools," he cried, and was gone. Just to reinforce that every word of Tolkien cannot be taken literally, when he says "fly, you fools," he's clearly, I don't think anyone misinterprets that he's saying flee. It's a fancy way of saying flee, or an extra urgent way of saying flee. That's what I think he's talking specifically to Aragorn and Boromir, who are going to go help him on this bridge. He says, "Flee, you fools." Well, he says, "Fly, you fools." He's not telling them to flap their wings and fly. That's a language thing with Tolkien, just as Tolkien was saying earlier in the passage when he says that the Balrog spread his wings. He had clearly previously made that a simile. A simile is, of course, a figure of speech that compares two things to make that aren't the same, to make a clear point about what one of them is. So Tolkien says this darkness is like wings is gathered around the Balrog, and then he spreads his wings. It seems very clear. This is not a winged creature that we're talking about. Let me also be clear that if I were making a movie of The Lord of the Rings, and that would be pretty fun, please hand me the contract to HBO and the Silmarillion, which is completely not available for the rights, or Rings of Power. Be happy to help out there. If that were handed to me, I would do a lot like the good folks at Weta Workshop did. The designers of that Balrog, I think, were brilliant. They needed to make emotional content. They need to make it work for the viewer, to be a scary creature of shadow and flame that would be able to be equal to Gandalf. And I think they did a great job. And I have no issue whatsoever with how that Balrog is depicted. But I also don't... It's, it doesn't have to be the same of the book, but I don't think that Tolkien believed that Balrogs were winged creatures. Now then, is any of this important? Not really. Is any of it fun and interesting? Yes, absolutely, which is why we talk about it. But what I don't understand, sometimes people get angry about these things, adamant even, and I don't understand that at all. So if you really want to hang on to the idea that Balrogs had wings, you be my guest. I think it's clear from Tolkien's text in Lord of the Rings that they don't. Now, that isn't to say, absolutely, definitively, that they can't fly. I don't think they could fly by flapping the wings they didn't have, but they were these incredible beings of power. Maybe they had rooted themselves in these physical bodies for so long that maybe they couldn't fly. They have been hiding in the deep places of the earth since they were defeated in the First Age, and they went and hid. Oh, it should be mentioned that Morgoth, who was partnered up with Shelob's, I guess, mother, Ungoliant. Ungoliant was so powerful at one point that she kind of trapped Morgoth in a web. In strands of a web, and he called none other than the Balrogs to come use their whips to cut those webs so he could be free. That's just a fun sidebar. I don't know which was the best option there, to unleash Morgoth or let Ungoliant reign supreme. Anyway, these Balrogs, I don't think Tolkien meant for them to be like the air assault of Morgoth or Sauron or whatever. It's also interesting that this Balrog, awakened by the dwarves when digging in Khazad-dûm. Durin's Bane is another one of his names. Interesting that he wasn't a servant of Sauron exactly, right? He's sort of a co-equal spirit, but he wasn't there to serve Sauron. In fact, he was focused on Gandalf in the attack. He didn't necessarily go for Frodo. That's a whole different subject. I probably shouldn't even have said that. People are going to debate that too, but I think that's apparent. He saw this being of power, this Gandalf, who was actually, somebody who would threaten him, who in fact eventually threw him down. Well, that does remind me, but the throwing down means that it's Tolkien's language. It doesn't mean that he dropped him from a height. It means that he killed him, means that he defeated him. The similar language that he was thrown down, and he couldn't do anything about it because he was defeated. Anyhow, Tolkienites, that's a pretty good, healthy discussion of Balrogs, which are really cool. There's some really cool collectibles from Sideshow Collectibles of Balrogs. I think they're limited and they're in the past, so you might have to pay second market premium prices. There's great art from Ted Naismith, by the way, which shows a Balrog with no wings as a blackened man-like figure in his flame and shadow. There's lots of Alan Lee. There's a John Howe of a Balrog with Glorfindel, I believe. There's a Lego Balrog. There's pretty cool pop culture stuff about Balrogs, all from the imagination of J.R.R. Tolkien. So we're going to keep this under half an hour. There's lots more to say. There's lots more to discuss, but not for me, not today. We could revisit this anytime. Perhaps we need to get those artists on. That'd be fun. Ted Naismith is a guy I've never talked to. I'd love to talk to him. I may have an interview saved up with John Howe or Alan Lee, but John is they're quiet. Alan Lee even more is a really soft-spoken guy, so his interview I'll have to pump up the volume. But I don't know. I can't promise that one, but maybe. But we'll definitely get that Ian McKellen interview up at some time. I have also an interview that I'm going to post relatively soon with Richard Taylor of Weta Workshop, a guy that I admire and love and can call a friend. Actually, he's been really great to me over the years. So we'll get that posted soon. In the meantime, if you think this was worth your time, it would be a great favor if you would tell someone else. That's word of mouth is the best way that these things get passed on from one person to another. If you know Tolkienites, if you know people who are interested in learning more about these things, who maybe know The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit and want to learn more, or maybe enjoyed the movies, or maybe who are watching Rings of Power, there's lots of online resources about all of these things, but this is meant to be part of the conversation. And speaking of conversations, we'll have more of those. Another really great episode, I think, is to talk about coins of Middle Earth. They exist in the real world. Anyhow, thank you for listening. It is deeply appreciated. If we ever have a chance to meet in person and I have a Twinkie on hand, it's yours. My name is Larry Curtis. This is the Tolkien Podcast.